In this episode, I am joined by Victor Shiryaev, teacher of Buddhist and modern meditation and somatic practices. Victor recounts his childhood in the Soviet Union, early underground exposure to the New Age, and subsequent study of Advaita Vedānta and Ken Wilber's integral theory. Victor details his discipleship under American mindfulness teacher Shinzen Young, reflects on the tension between tradition and innovation, and shares stories of his own awakening experiences. Victor also lays out his disagreements with Shinzen Young's approach, critiques the Pragmatic Dharma movement's use of maps and stages, and presents his own understanding of the spiritual experiences to be expected on the road to awakening and beyond. So without further ado, Victor Shiryaev. Victor Shiryaev, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, nice to meet you.
Well, I'm so pleased to be talking with you today. Long-time student of Shinzen Young, so in fact we share a meditation teacher. That's quite fun. And gosh, you've had a very interesting life indeed. So thank you first of all for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a deep pleasure.
So I wonder if we might set the scene a little bit for your life. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your upbringing, the context of your upbringing. What sort of a home did you grow up in?
I was born in Soviet Union, in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, back in the 80s, 84. And, a secular family, nothing really special about it, quite educated, but definitely not religious and not spiritual. But then I got to a Jewish school. I was going to a Jewish school for 10 years. And it was like a comprehensive school with all the maths and geography and physics and all of the normal subjects, but also the Jewish subjects, tradition, history, religion. And so I was exposed to this kind of knowledge and talk from early on. And so by that time, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there were a lot of different like new ideas coming, new agey stuff coming, lots of like fake spiritual and real spirituality flowing into Russia, as well as all the late Soviet Union samizdat is called, what's called samizdat is self-publishing. So like people were self-publishing, not in like the Amazon kind of way, but literally on a typewriter, typing, retyping like Yoga Sutras and Buddhist stuff and Chan Buddhist in particular, as well as a lot of esoteric materials. And they were persecuted for that. So it was kind of all hidden and all exchanged, hand to hand in the 80s. But then with perestroika coming and with all the laws loosening a bit, and especially after the Soviet Union collapse, it all kind of unearthed in big numbers. So people got interested in that. My mother got pretty interested in all things in like healing stuff, healing aspects, and healthy living in general. So she was taking me to those different healers. I was quite a sick child, allergic, asthma kind of periods, let's say. And also at a certain point, I was almost eaten alive by a big dog. So like a near-death kind of experience. I spent a lot of time in a hospital recovering from that. And so by the age of 10, I saw a psychotherapist for the first time. I remember his advice. Well, he said that I was pretty sound and pretty well, considering the event, and that the only thing that he could advise me to do was to draw the nightmarish dog that I kept seeing every night after the event, and burn this drawing, So that was his advice. My first psychotherapeutic thing to do. Also another big influence on me was my tennis teacher, actually, who was coincidentally a theater guy from Leningrad, and he was clearly interested in like yogic stuff, and I only understood it years later that he had us like playing big tennis, and at the same time, by the end of the session, he would make us stare at a candle flame, do these kinds of like concentration type exercises, or he would have like a pile of different colorful postcards spread on the floor, and he would ask us to pick a card that corresponds to our emotional state most. So, like developing emotional intelligence, I guess. So it was very interesting. It was not tennis training mostly. And by the ninth grade, I was reading transpersonal psychology. My chemistry teacher in the ninth grade, knowing that I was like into this stuff, gave me Stanislav Grof's book as a present. So like about the perinatal matrices, the stages that you go through while being birthed. And so I got really interested in all that, tried different stuff while in school. And so then I enrolled to a university, and it was the Oriental department, Chinese studies, Chinese history. So that was my first exposure to Buddhist texts, Mahayana Buddhist texts in particular. I was fortunate enough to study a little bit with one of the best Mahayana scholars, the late Torchinov. Eugene Torchinov was quite a well-known Russian scholar of Mahayana and Chinese Buddhism in particular. And he was very ill by that time, but still I managed to attend a few seminars that he taught. And yeah, so that's my journey in short. But then the real journey began when I was like really deep into like Advaita Vedānta kind of stuff, Nisargadatta Maharaj. I was reading his writings extensively and trying to apply it all to my life. By around that time, I started to read Ken Wilber's books. So it's, say, 2005-ish, maybe, and practicing a lot, but not sure practicing what exactly. But I used to have a lot of altered experiences, peak experiences, since very little. So I kind of intuitively I explored that altered states territory. So lucid dreaming when I was ill and feverish, for example, and then later, maybe when I was 9, 10, 11, I had a unity experience, a very profound experience that actually informed all my life since then. It was a very average thing, a very average day. We went for a walk in a park in St. Petersburg, and a squirrel came up to us, to a path, and something clicked, something happened, and we merged, and I experienced this unity with life, with a capital L, life in general, and it was profound and amazing. And so all of those experiences, as well as this exposure to texts and different unusual things that I've witnessed. For example, when I was bitten by that dog, eaten is quite a technical way to put it. A healer came to me when I was in a hospital. It was my father's colleague's son, who was sort of a famous healer back then. And when he visited me in a hospital, I couldn't walk because my leg was quite torn quite severely. And my arm also wouldn't move. I had a broken finger, bitten off, literally. And I had an inflammation. I don't know the technical English word for that kind of inflammation, but it's like something septic, something bacterial and dangerous. And so when he came to me, I had this very red part of my skin, and he just placed an arm, and it became pale and white in a matter of seconds. And also I remember him first kind of testing me, I guess, testing my susceptibility to his healing abilities or something, when he would move his hand over my arm and asking me what I feel. And I felt as if a small ball would roll under my skin, like a very small, maybe 5 millimeter diameter, that it rolls under my skin. And I told him that, and he was like, okay, perfect. That's what I had to hear. So now we can begin. So I was exposed to these kinds of things from early on, and combined with my altered states, I was really into that stuff, trying to explore as much as I can, trying to understand how it works. So that was my main drive that led me into spiritual seeking. Basically, it's this question of, what is this? How does it work? What's real? And so I spent maybe the first decade of my spiritual life as a seeker of truth, of knowledge. But then when I was living in China, around 2008, 2009, I was already deep into integral theory, and I've already met Shinzen. And at that time, I had a wife, I had a dog, a car. I was working at a joint venture, a Chinese-Russian factory, manufacturing huge valves, factory valves. Working as a translator, interpreter, kind of a person connecting the two sides, basically. And at that time, I fell right into the crisis, personal crisis, what I want to do in life, what I want to be. Is this the life that I want? Is this the way that I want to live? And it was very deep and very existential. And I remember crying and asking the skies for advice. So the next part was not about what's true or what's real, but about what's working, what's in it for me, how can I deal with my pain, basically. So it's the first part is about truth, the second part is about suffering, which ended at a Upandita retreat in Myanmar. I was temporarily ordained as a Theravada monk under the late Upandita in Myanmar. Upandita was a Mahasi Sayadaw successor. And at that retreat, 2012, 2013, winter 60-day retreat, maybe the 10th day or the 15th day of the retreat, I finally felt that the quest was over. Not in a sense that now I know everything, but in a sense that the quest itself does not burn as much, or I'm not sure how to put it well. I was not seeking anymore anyway. I found what I needed, and I could proceed from that foundation further. Maybe that would be a good way to describe it. And it never returned ever since then. Although I do obviously find myself in different kinds of existential pits nowadays as well. Also because of the whole political situation, world situation. I'm deeply involved with the Russian community, with the Ukrainian community, and kind of torn Israeli community, and I'm kind of torn between all those agendas and friends and ideas. So this whole unpredictability of where it's going is hard to endure, but I still feel quite, how should I put it, confident in that whatever I know is true and working is actually true and working. So that's that. Sorry for a long intro. Hopefully it shed some light.
That was fascinating. Yes, and thank you for that summary. We can go back over some of those points now.
Thank you.
Particularly, perhaps we should start at the very end there, that last part. You know that what you have is working. I wonder if you might unpack that turn of phrase a little bit.
The way I view a practice, contemplative practice and somatic practices, is quite pragmatic. So I follow my teachers here, Shinzen in particular, also Paul Linden, a teacher of somatics. In that they don't teach things that you have to accept as true necessarily, like some metaphysical claims that you have to have faith in order for them to work. But rather, they provide a set of hypotheses that you can test, that you can run an experiment and see for yourself. And after doing those experiments over and over again for, 17 years now, since I finally understood what I had to do. So say 2009, since 2009. So by just doing those experiments over and over again, I see the results, and that's how I know that they're working. So it's very simple. I don't have to assume anything.
I'm curious about two things from what you've said there. The first is this turn of phrase. When I knew what I needed to do in 2009, I'm curious if you could unpack exactly what you mean
Sure.
by that,
Sure,
and that,
sure.
and biographically as well. Something evidently happened there
Okay.
that gave you
Okay,
some sort of.
sure.
And then the second thing is, perhaps you could give an example of the application of these experiments and the result that gave you the sense that it worked. Maybe some sort of a practical example like that would also be very useful.
Okay. Sure. Fair enough. A short disclaimer, though. I'm not as good with my English as I may come off. So I'm way more fluent in describing those things in Russian, obviously. So the way I phrase things, um, it could be somewhat crude because of my use of English phrases and words, and not necessarily the way I intended it to be phrased. But nevertheless, okay. The biggest turning point for me was definitely meeting Shinzen Young back in 2009. Uh, I probably heard him speaking before that, like Buddha at the Gas Pump podcast, maybe the Buddhist Geeks podcast. But it was 2009 that I've actually started to train the way he teaches to train, meaning to apply concentration, power, sensory clarity, and equanimity, the three core mindfulness skills, as he dissects the whole mindfulness thing into three well-defined skill sets that one has to master as applied to the everyday and moment-to-moment sensory experience that flows through us or that we perceive. So the way we approach this experience, the way we parse this sensory data, influences what we understand ourselves to be, what we understand about the world, how it's actually constructed in our immediate experience. So by applying those three sensory skills, or better, by beginning to discern that those three skills are actually at play at every moment of our living experience, and the way we interact with it heavily influences the way we live in the end. By beginning to do that, we get more skill in applying those sensory skills. And well, it changes everything, basically. So concentration power is our ability to be present, basically, to be present with whatever we deem relevant. So, for example, be it some difficult emotions, or be our painful physical experience, physical pains, or our thoughts, any all kinds of experiences. By being present and open to them and opening towards them, uh, we get to live, basically. And by that I mean that if we are not present, we miss a lot. And if we miss a lot, we don't have a chance to get more skilled in living through all these kinds of experience that life comprises. And so being present is important. So it's basically attention training, concentration training in general. But then when we begin to open up to those experiences, we realize that we don't know them. So that's the sensory clarity aspect. So by lacking presence, we don't have enough opportunities to get to know all this. So I usually call it, what would be an English way to put it, observational statistics, maybe. So the way I teach and the way relate to this is that our attention works, well, we are sporadically present, and also attention has this negativity bias, so we tend to be more present when something is wrong or painful. So when it's sporadic and when it's only biased towards negative stuff, we get the wrong statistics, okay? 16 times per day here and there and here and there, and then we kind of derive our knowledge about ourselves and the world through that statistics, which is obviously skewed and wrong. But then, as Upandita used to say, in 1 minute of 1 minute of meditation gives you 60 moments of mindfulness, and 10 minutes of meditation give you 600 moments of mindfulness, and 1 hour of meditation gives you 3,600 moments of consecutive mindfulness. Knowledge and moments of knowledge. So that's a very different kind of statistics, that you can actually begin to know yourself, actually, what's actually happening. How am I relating to my immediate experience moment by moment? So that's sensory clarity. And what we find out is that we relate to this experience in a not so skillful way. We tend to be reactive, protective, turning away, and so forth. So lacking equanimity in Shinzen's terms. Lacking equanimity meaning that we don't allow our experience to flow as naturally as it could flow. And rather trying to stop it, to resist it, to push it away, to not let go, and so forth. So that's another skill that we have to develop. And back to my story, when I was living in China in 2009 and going through this existential crisis and hearing Shinzen for some time explaining all those things, and thanks to Shinzen for being so open. Obviously, he was one of the early adopters of all things internet, and it was very important for me that I could actually stay in China and still being able to learn from him, because he was outputting, even back then, there were a lot of videos on the internet, while Har Prakash, of course, and Stephanie Nash and other students that actually uploaded his videos. But it was very, very important that I got this knowledge straight from him, and I got involved in the online community that was being built at that time. So I began to actually studying with him also, and attending his home practice programs that run to this day, which is absolutely crazy, which is a monthly weekend home practice retreat, meaning that by the use of a landline telephone, you're telephoning to a group kind of room. I don't know what's the best way to call it, like a group session that you can then mute yourself and then just listen to a talk and then a guided meditation. And so I started to attend those monthly retreats. And yeah, it was life-changing for me. I changed my work. I got divorced. And eventually I went to that winter retreat with Upandita, which was definitely a turning point in my life, because after that I went back to Russia and I switched completely into teaching this stuff. So at first I was teaching less meditation and more integral theory, integral approach kind of things, because by that time I also graduated from JFK University, which was a Californian institution providing master's degree in integral theory, Ken Wilber's integral theory approach. And I got really interested in that. And by that time, I graduated, had my master's degree. So when I went back to Russia, I began first to teach these kinds of things, also like infusing it with mindfulness and meditation. And maybe after 2 years of doing that, I switched completely to teaching mindfulness and meditation. Yeah, so hopefully that was part biographical, part practical.
What insight did you gain into your existential crisis? Was it primarily circumstantial? You've referred to some life changes you made. You left your marriage and changed your job, etc., and went back to Russia and so on. Were those the main factors? Was there something else going on? What, during that period, were you able to understand about that? And what was that understanding relevant to coming out of it?
Well, it's a good question, but I think that an honest answer would be that it was like mostly a personal crisis in a very down-to-earth kind of sense, meaning that as many of us do, when we grow up, we don't really know what we want to be, what we want to do. I always envied those people who knew what they want to do from like very early on. Like I want to be a doctor, stuff like this. But usually it was connected to some kind of trauma or traumatic experience that made them this way, like very certain from a very early age. And for most of the folk is just whatever, playing video games and enjoying life and trying to figure it all. So I guess it was my youth as well. As I've said, I had a lot of interest in all these things, but I never fathomed that I could actually make a living out of it and make it my profession. And in terms of profession, even going to a Chinese department, Oriental Studies, was not really my choice. It was a pure accident. I mean, I was definitely into humanities, not like the math and physics and things like that. But I didn't know what I want to study or what I want to be. And it was really a pure accident. We were at a dacha, a Russian village house, just walking in the forest with our neighbors. And it was like the 9th or 10th grade. And they asked my parents whether I knew what I want to study. And maybe a short disclaimer, every educated Russian family, sons and daughters, have to go to university. It's like an unspoken law, everyone goes to a university, of course. Of course, after school, you go to a university, you get a degree. So it was not a question of me going or not going to university. It was a question of what I want to study. And I didn't know. And they said, oh, Chinese is very, is on the rise. China is on the rise. It's very future-proof kind of thing. You study Chinese, you're set for life. It's very good. And my parents were like, yeah, okay, makes sense, Chinese. So yeah, so that's how it happened, and I'm really glad it happened that way because I met my partner, my wife there in China, my current and hopefully lost wife in China, and now that I am very interested in Chinese Buddhism and Tiantai school of Mahayana Buddhism in particular, going back this full circle kind of back to my roots, and starting to translate all the meditation manuals from the early medieval Buddhist Chinese language into Russian, and starting to teach this stuff and getting deeper and deeper into this Tiantai philosophy. This is a major turning point for me now and a major thing in my life now. And it probably wouldn't happen if I hadn't had this foundation of Chinese studies in the first place. So I'm really glad, obviously, really glad it happened, but I didn't have a say in it, really. I mean, I did have a say, but I didn't care. So, yeah, whatever, Chinese studies. So, yeah, when I was living in China by the time of this existential crisis, the question was whether that was the life that I wanted to live. Working at a factory, translating for like huge valves, steel valves, manufacturers, arranging this whole manufacturing thing. And I got really dissatisfied. Also in my marriage then. And the way it worked, I actually wrote a letter. So I took a pen, I took a piece of paper, and I wrote a letter like, Dear Nature, or whatever, Dear God, let me find my teacher. Let me, whatever, find my way in life. I don't remember. But I was living in this tall building, apartment building. And I made a paper airplane from this piece of paper. I went to the roof, so 27th floor, I guess, something like that. Suburbs of a city called Wenzhou in eastern China. And I set that airplane flying into the air. I mean, it was in Russian, whatever. People could find it. They're all Chinese. So nobody would care. Even if they could, pick it up and find it. So I just set it to fly with the intention of somehow communicating with the universe. And I'm not exaggerating. It's an actual real story. I just went back, took the elevator back to my 7th floor, and I got into my room and I opened email, and I had this email in my inbox. The very, like, in a 5 minutes stretch, basically, from that point to that point. I got this email saying, from an unknown person, unknown to me, that we found your blog posts online about the city, and I was, blogging some stuff about the place that I was living at. This Wenzhou is a very famous place. Not Wenzhou probably no one knows, but it's a small 8 million people city in China, and it's like mostly factories and factories and factories. But the surrounding Zhejiang province is a very famous place for its shanshui meaning mountains and waters. So all those paintings, like traditional paintings of, this lonely traveler with his sack behind his bag, crossing a crooked bridge over the stream and those pine trees and, this kind of scenery. So that's exactly that place where it came from. And the poetry also. So Shanshui. So I was blogging about it, and they read my posts, and they were saying that their qigong teacher, who was by that time living in Moscow for maybe 10 years, teaching qigong and kung fu, Chinese traditional martial arts, and like healing exercises, healing strategies, was going back to China, to his native place, to his native village, to build a retreat center there, to invite people from, like, Russian-speaking people from all over to come to him to study with him. And they asked me in that email whether I want to work with them. Basically, they invited me first to go to meet him, to talk to him, and well, I immediately was hooked, and it was a very interesting, although quite frustrating experience in the end, because I was kind of banished. It's a long story, but it was a huge misunderstanding. But I was working with them for 2 years. I met my martial arts teacher through that Qigong teacher, who was his brother, a spiritual brother, martial arts brother. And I started to practice with that Bagua, the 8 trigrams, martial arts teacher. And it kind of snowballed just from that point. And I quit my job at a factory, started to work with that Qigong teacher for a few years. And I was thinking what to do with my life, so I enrolled into this master's program, the integral theory, distance learning master's program, master's degree. Yeah, so that's how it all happened.
That's very interesting. So, reading between the lines, the crisis was a crisis of purpose or direction in life. And
Right.
the solution was finding purpose or direction. And that purpose and direction that you found was in this sort of spiritual, if we can say that, direction.
Yes, you might put it this way. In Ken Wilber's terms, it would be something about the unique self, or the unique application of my abilities, individual abilities, the way, the things that I can do better, or in my personal way, than someone else. So doing the things that I didn't want to do, doing things that I didn't see meaning in, was giving me a lot of unease, obviously. And so I was searching for the ways to be more, well, useful, I guess. And yeah, I think we could use the word service, or as I sometimes half jokingly say, this job of a translator, of an interpreter, is basically what I do, because I don't see myself as a teacher. I mean, there is this word teacher, but I don't teach anything that comes from myself. It's not like come to me, I share this knowledge with you that I possess. Rather I conduct it through me. So in the best way possible, I am this interpreter or translator of whatever comes to me and through me, and uh, being as transparent as possible, being as clear as possible, um, being as precise as possible. That's mostly what I do. That's how I relate to what I do. Um, be it like actual translations that I actually make, or just, meditation or somatics teaching. And the things that um, the things that I do, that I teach, are about these fundamental qualities of our attention, perception, and life processing, immediate processing, if it makes sense. So in this regard, it could be existential, because what else? It's existential to its core when you turn towards this immediate experience. You're facing these existential things, big in a big way. The questions of life and death and who am I and all of those, like, quite immediately so. But also because it's about the ways we live in the moment and the ways our attention works, it's very applied. So I could be of a very applied help, helping people manage their emotions or develop their concentration skills. I did a course for the Lloyd's Maritime Academy. Lloyd's Maritime Academy is a British establishment for maritime officers. And they have a lot of different courses. So I made this course on mindfulness, which in their case was called situational awareness, because most of the problems that they face in the open sea is about situational awareness, basically, and lack of this awareness. Although also the solitude and, well, different problems. But mostly I was concerned with the situational awareness because of the lack of sleep, the different factors. So it's very applied, right? It's nothing existential about it, nothing spiritual about it. Very, very straightforward, but in exactly the same set of principles and exactly the same set of skills that I taught through that course. And hopefully, maybe by doing some of those practices, they could come to a deeper stuff as well. Who knows?
You hope then that they will find a deeper religious or spiritual significance then through these applications. These are, if you want, mundane applications. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure how to put it. To be fair, I don't really think that people have to find these spiritual questions or answers, matters necessarily. I think that you cannot impose it on people. You cannot push it. You cannot push people towards those kinds of things. So people begin to explore it when they are ready, I guess. And also when they know about it. So, like in Buddhism, they say how treacherous it is to encounter Dharma in one's life. So, for example, like the first thought is how wonderful it is to be born as a human, right? But you can be born as a human and never encounter anything like this in your whole life. So it's another matter how fortunate I am to actually hear this stuff as I was fortunate, for example, to find Shinzen, and I regard him as my main teacher ever since. Although I've studied with many different teachers, and now I'm very into this Tiantai philosophy and practice and teachings. But still, Shinzen is the guy, is the man, and yeah, I mean, I could easily miss him. And so I think that it's important to create a culture that is open about those things. And I kind of see it happening now. Obviously, a big splash was with this whole New Agey stuff and this whole turn towards the Eastern religions in general. And now I think that we witness another wave of this interest again, but hopefully in a maybe a deeper sense, maybe with more knowledge about all this. And well, we kind of need it, don't we? I mean, looking at what's happening when the COVID pandemic started, I remember many Buddhist teachers saying that this is exactly what we were studying for, what we were training for, to be of help in times of crisis. And I think it's even more true now than it was in the beginning of the pandemic. So I think it's important to create this kind of culture that people can get exposed to those things, to get to know about it in hopefully a meaningful enough way to not regard it as too superficial or like pure bullshit that no one clever could really be interested in. And so through this exposure, they could at least know about this stuff enough that when the time comes, they could get really interested in this stuff. But without this initial exposure, it's hard to imagine that you can like push people or awaken people really. So one of the things that I do is trying to create this culture. Actually, I don't think about this way necessarily. It's just the way of saying this now. But I guess that's what I was always doing since I started doing this work. So I became one of the mindfulness pioneers in the Russian-speaking world, translating and teaching extensively in all like formats, online, offline. And by that time, this whole secular mindfulness movement was relatively unknown in our parts. And so I just started to output a huge amount of whatever I could, basically. So translating, doing podcasts, doing courses, running offline classes, establishing a mindfulness practice center, first in Russia, in St. Petersburg, then co-founding a mindfulness practice center in Odessa, Ukraine, and training teachers and appearing in magazines like Men's Health and kinds of those kinds of magazines, like promoting mindfulness practices. So doing all kinds of stuff, organizing conferences, just to spread the word, so to speak, and hopefully to correct all the misunderstandings that people could face when trying to learn something about those mindfulness practices and approaches, because it's there is a lot of bullshit. There is a lot of very unethical, very superficial coaches and teachers and articles and all kinds of information that gives you a very skewed picture and ideas about what it is, and that could be applicable in some cases, but in the long run it just wouldn't work and would harm potentially. So I was always kind of both promoting and defending the right view, so to speak. So yeah, that's my take on it. That it's more about being exposed to this kind of culture, to get to know about those things, and then you can choose for yourself whether you want it or not, whether it makes sense or not. And also, even when I speak about the Buddhist enlightenment matters and the Buddha nature and things like that, I always make sure that the ways that I talk about it are utterly pragmatic and are not just a string of nonsensical words that sound well but don't mean much. So turning it to pragmatic, turning it to applicable, and the way Shinzen, for example, says, and Paul Linden also uses this word. They like this word operationalizing. Okay, so for example, turning nouns into verbs, okay, would be one way to put it. So this is an actual instruction, what we can do in order to achieve this and that. Yeah.
That's very interesting indeed. You've mentioned some of your teachers, Paul Linden, Shinzen, Ken Wilber, and something you said about being a translator or sort of channel for other people's ideas. When I think of someone like Ken Wilber or Shinzen, undoubtedly, both of them have drawn on ideas. I mean, they're both epistemizers,
integralists, yes,
and refer to those ideas often. Both, I think, are sometimes criticized by specialists in the fields from which they draw for misunderstanding those influences, and that occasionally those inferences make sense only within the system that they're inputting it into. But this, I think, is the nature of the dialogue between the generalist and the specialist. It always has that
Yes.
quality.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
in a sense, I'm describing something quite standard. However, somebody like Shinzen or Ken Wilber are also not simply content to draw on influences from different traditions, systems, disciplines, etc., mediums, but also they want to systemize, repackage, rethink, create taxonomies,
Yes. Yes.
labels, new categories. In a sense, they are generating something that is, whilst influenced from other sources, theirs, you could say.
Yes. Yes.
I'm curious, yet I hear you say you are content to be and derive great satisfaction from being a clear channel, a sort of conduit for
Oh man,
ideas.
I
But
see where it's headed.
well, I'm curious. I'm curious.
Sure.
You see where it's headed. Okay, let's see if it's headed in the direction you think it is. I'm curious if you see a distinction, I suppose, between what you're doing
Mm.
as a clear conduit of other people's ideas. Clear, meaning not coloring it with the conduit is not coloring what's coming through it, right?
Mm.
And what somebody like Shinzen or Ken Wilber does, similarly drawing on many things, but somehow there's this urge, almost entrepreneurial or almost sort of innovative kind of urge to imprint themselves on it somehow, or imprint at least their thinking on it somehow.
What you're saying is absolutely right. And I don't see necessarily a contradiction there. By being a clear conduit, I also, by necessity, color everything that passes through me with my unique way of synthesizing and approaching all that. I do not see it as a contradiction, as I've said, but maybe it is a paradox. Let me come from a different angle. As you've said, clearly, there are people who are more inclined towards integrating different strands of knowledge, seeing big pictures, and trying to create comprehensive frameworks for including different kinds and types of knowledge. In Shinzen's case, it's all the different contemplative techniques and approaches. Wilber's is more ambitious, is about all the strands of human knowledge, maybe, or at least all the different types of developmental theories all put together. And also, for example, this Khentai school of Buddhism, its founder, his name was Zhi, and Zhi was this patriarch of the Khentai school, and he was one of the early Chinese teachers and the first Chinese teacher to create a comprehensive framework to include all the different strands of Buddhist ideas and practices that were already available in China by that time, which is the 6th century AD. And by that time, there were many different paths through which Buddhist ideas, practices, schools, sects, texts, translators were coming to China. And there was no one comprehensive overview of how all of those fit together. And he was actually the first Chinese teacher to create this comprehensive framework claiming to include all of the Buddhist ideas and practices into it. And well, I guess different people are just drawn to this stuff. So it's not a coincidence that I'm a student of Ken Wilber and Shinzen Young and Zhi. I like this stuff. Obviously, I am drawn to these kinds of comprehensive frameworks, integral frameworks, and so back to your question about how to be a conduit of knowledge without staining it with your own biased, understandings and whatnot. Well, a few things come to mind. First, that we have to understand that it's inevitable, in a sense, that we all have our individual stance and understanding, and being like contemporary teachers, we have our certain ways of talking about things that people 100 years ago would just definitely put in different kinds of words just by being 100 years ago, by living 100 years ago. So necessarily in 100 years, people would do it in a yet another different way for sure. So first thing is that it's important to understand that this is the case and be transparent about it. And I never claim to be a source of knowledge, as I've said. I never claim that what I say is true. Just the opposite. I always try to encourage people. There is this idea in both like modern psychotherapy and embodiment world, embodiment approach of empowerment, meaning that we don't want people to get too attached to us as teachers, so that they seek our presence or classes or whatever in order to find their own comfort and their own standing, but rather through teaching people how to apply those practices, they can find meaning and benefit for themselves and learn to internalize those things and to be able to do them by themselves. So I always frame everything that I teach as, well, first, my way, for example. Yeah, this is the way I understand it, and it's not necessarily true. Second, there is no exclusivity to my way of teaching, meaning that I know there are hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of teachers out there who can be more suited to particular individuals, and I never know. Of course, I never know what's what will click, so to say, for a certain individual. So there is no exclusivity to what I do. It's a certain way that I teach. It's a certain way that I use language. It's a certain set of practices that can suit you, or maybe they won't suit you, but it's not the ultimate knowledge that if you don't master it, you miss it. I don't regard it this way. And I'm always transparent about this, for example. So you can kind of bracket it if you want. So that's one way, for example, to do that. Another way is to say that what I do is meaning making. That this whole information is out there. It's nothing exclusive about what I teach, but it's a certain way of framing it, of making meaning out of it, that could resonate with someone. And I'm also transparent about that. And yeah, as I've said, third is that there are no claims, metaphysical claims, or like claims about stuff that you cannot test. Just the opposite. Actually, the way I teach, I don't regard myself as Buddhist or a Buddhist teacher, for example, because I don't think that what I teach is Buddhist. I don't think it belongs to Buddhism, even though a lot of things that I teach are from the Buddhist texts and so on, Buddhist teachers. It is either ultimately discoverable, it is either ultimately discoverable and derivable from here, from this very moment, from this particular moment, or is a pile of bullshit. So either nirvana or Buddha nature or enlightenment are a bunch of words, myths, whatever, fairy tales, and we can regard it this way and talk about it culturally and whatever. Or there is nothing particularly Buddhist about it, and it is ultimately discoverable in the very moment. So by necessity, we start from this very moment. We start this exploration from this very moment, and then slowly we begin to get, accustomed to the way it works. And then by working through a more gross kind of level, we get to subtler things and to more subtler things and so on. So yeah, maybe those few thoughts are somehow leading into the right direction. I'm not sure, but hopefully it makes sense.
It's very interesting to hear you think through these things and express your perspective on it. You mentioned paradox, and there is a tension, I think, in these things between, for example, testability and faith or suspension of disbelief, because some of these things are not testable in the short term immediately. They require a sustained engagement. That's the same with going to the gym or trying to learn to play chords on the guitar or so. In a way, you have to trust somehow that there's a reasonable chance that your practice will lead to something, and that's not something you can really verify until it happens. Although you can look around, and one of the ways you can tell is, can your teacher do it?
It's true. Yes, it's true.
So there's a bit of a paradox there, but the ultimate, you're pointing to the ultimate arbiter of whether it works ought to be one's experience, and not because some body or some text says so.
By necessity. I mean, what other way is there?
Well, there are other ways people do it.
Okay, there are other ways. Fair enough. Sorry.
Well, no, fair enough. And you're concerned to be a clear conduit, and it seems to me, therefore, what you're a clear conduit for isn't necessarily a particular set of ideas or doctrines, but it's a sort of discovery process. And in that, I think I recognize something you have in common with someone like Shinzen. Shinzen does not seem to feel the need to be a clear conduit of ancient wisdom or or intact tradition. In fact, rather provocatively at times, he claims, that I've heard him say, that the old traditions don't have it right, actually. And he says that's one of the reasons there are many different traditions, all of which have something but can't quite agree and so on. And he thinks actually we have work to do. He takes a sort of scientific method approach. We have work to do in questioning and taking apart and testing and innovating and finding new models and so on towards enlightenment. That's his thing, towards enlightenment. And he seems to think that that applying that kind of a experimental method will derive something that's superior to the prior traditions. Whereas other people will say the prior traditions, actually there's something pure, right? The old masters had it, and it's our job in a sense to be a clear conduit of a different sort that simply conducts the wisdom of the lineage forward. Although there may be some innovation in terms of the form in which something is presented, what we are passing on is something already perfected.
I take the middle ground here. I don't agree with either of these claims. I'm not a Buddhist in that I don't regard the historic Buddha as the omniscient, supernatural being that perfected everything. And in this regard, I side closer with Ken Wilber, who says that it's evolutionary and developmental in nature. So, for example, I see Mahayana ideas as more advanced than early Buddhist ideas, simply because they were honed by hundreds of thousands of people over hundreds of years. So they had this interpersonal validation kind of and honing process to them. And so I don't really see how it is possible to just try to preserve the original crystal teaching without changing it in any way, exactly because we have our unique selves and everyone expresses it in a different way in a contemporary setting. And even those who claim to preserve this original teaching, which is mostly Theravada Buddhists, who kind of Southern Buddhism, who think that they are orthodox enough in preserving it. But then again, most of them actually base their understanding on commentarial works that are pretty late. It's like mid first millennium AD, which is kind of late even by Mahayana standards. So I think that it's way better actually to not mythologize the ancients too much as way more advanced. Well, they were, for sure, many of them were way more sincere practitioners than modern practitioners are, just by being solely devoted to that, being monastics and being, ascetics and not doing anything else. But I don't really think that they got everything sorted out. And I do feel that teachings evolve. And because teachings evolve, I cannot side with Shinzen's view that science will finally solve everything and all the problems and give us the ultimate picture of how it all works. I think it's very modernist take, a very modernist take, very representative of his generation, basically, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, I love Shinzen with all my heart, and he is like a second father to me, literally. Like he gave me what my real father couldn't give, a second life, basically. And I mean all that when I say it. I mean, I don't want to sound disrespectful in saying that I don't side with his idea that science will solve everything. But I don't think it will. There is a huge meaning in art, creativity, ritual, spontaneity, unknowing, mysticism, subtle connections, all those kinds of things that are very hard to put into quantifiable terms and easily definable terms. It's what Ian McGilchrist, John Vervaeke, and people like that talk about a lot, that this modernist approach kind of loses that. And ironically enough, Shinzen himself embodies this a lot. He's a very poetic, very creative, very inspired individual, that it was one of those things that drew me to him in the first place. That on one hand, he was like very extremely precise with everything that he wanted to convey, but at the same time, he could cite those Thomas Eliot poems and the Dark Night of the Soul and whatnot, and being, very poetic and shedding tears, reciting those. And so those two sides spoke to me deeply, because I am also sort of that way. So I think there is a lot of treasure, a lot of real deep meaning in all these kinds of things that science won't necessarily have answer to. And so I feel that this creative impulse will give birth to many more ideas and ways of expressing this primordial existential stuff that everyone can sense. And because it's by definition inconceivable, it's beyond words, it's beyond rational thought. So when we try to put it into words and to shape it with rational thought, we come up with all those different ways of discussing it and arguing about it that so many Buddhist schools argue about, for example, and don't agree with each other, while still sharing all of those practices, right? Which is ironic, but also, I think, inevitable in a sense. So again, being humble enough, being open enough, and back to your question about this paradox of being a clear conduit, but also having your own input. I think, yes, maybe one of the ways that we can look at it is that I show the way by my example of doing things. So that could be a way of, understanding it, by being inquisitive, by being experimentative, by being transparent about it. Yeah, I think maybe it's a good way to actually put it, to show by example, to show the way by example. Thank you. I've never expressed it this way, and it makes sense to me, at least. I'm not sure about you or the listeners. Hopefully.
Yeah, very interesting. I'd like to ask you something else. It's a bit of in a different direction. But to wrap this up from my side anyway, and then if you have anything to add before we change direction, please do. I would say my understanding of Shinzen's idea about science and enlightenment isn't necessarily that advances made scientifically will invalidate ritual forms or poetic forms. It may provide a clearer explanatory framework for how those things work. But I don't think that necessarily one replaces the other in a sense.
No,
and I ought to say then that, Shinzen, as you know, is a fan of ritual of various types, a sun dancer. He's walked that red road, and other sorts of rituals too, and poetry and so on, and the power of not knowing. He says often, doesn't he, the body wants to be comfortable, the mind wants answers, and that actually part of, at least the training as far as he sees it, is to work through both of those drives. He says about the spirit of science, this idea of the spirit of science informing the Enlightenment project. I think, my understanding, but if you have a different understanding, by all means, is that the spirit of science is one of investigation, of innovation, of development, not necessarily one of debunking, particularly. And this, of course, I think can be contrasted with, as you pointed out, these approaches that suggest that what we really ought to be doing is preserving or reclaiming or rediscovering something that was in a golden age by a golden person discovered. I will say, though, Victor, I think one of the if you're going to talk about modernism, this idea of inevitable endless progress and this idea of a utopian outcome, that I think is certainly modernist. Now, so that's a different matter. Is Shinzen right? Will the spirit of experimentation, will the spirit of science actually lead to a clarification of the Enlightenment project that's been human-wide, it seems? Will it do that or not? Is that possible? That's another question. So anyway, I felt like worth, I suppose, reflecting that from my understanding of Shinzen's idea of the spirit of science informing the Enlightenment project isn't so much that science will replace it, but it will in some way meet it and help it along. But please disagree.
I agree. I mean, no, I do agree. We talked with him a year ago about this stuff, and we were exactly having this kind of argument. And I think that he was implying more that we don't necessarily need religions anymore once we kind of figure it out scientifically. I may be wrong, and it doesn't matter too much. What I believe is that, of course, religions will stay for as long as humanity is here, which may not be for too long, given the circumstances, but we'll see how it goes. Do you remember, maybe you know, that there was this old sci-fi series called Babylon 5?
Of course.
And Babylon 5 was this station, space station, a huge city, deep in space, like 2,500 something years. And there were Buddhist monks there visiting. And I remember loving that image, deep space, sci-fi setting, human and aliens interacting, and it's like far in the future, but there are still Buddhist monks and Christian monks and whatnot, which is kind of telling, and I think ultimately true. I mean, I can relate to that and believe that that will be the case. Uh, so no, I don't think that religions go anywhere. I do think that there is always this tension between orthodox and modernist, between the ones who want to preserve and the ones who want to evolve. And so different schools split, and it's a matter. What would be the best way to put it? The more advanced thinkers are either heretics or reformers. Maybe that would be a good way to put it. So if in its core the tradition is too orthodox and rejecting all the new ideas, then all the reformers are deemed heretics and wrong. And if it's more open, then maybe they can actually reform something and turn it into something new. I know a lot of people coming from the Russian Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodoxy, who turn towards Buddhist practices and Buddhist ideas. I have some Russian Orthodox priests attending my classes, for example, on like Chinese Buddhism. But at the same time, I know that if their seniors find out that they attend my classes, they get into big troubles because Russian Orthodox Church is very, very conservative, extremely conservative. So yoga is a deed of devil, kind of conservative. Physical yoga, I mean exercises. So, and even then, even these kinds of very conservative approaches and teachings find their audience, and I don't see it changing any soon. Especially when we consider Ken Wilber's view and this whole developmental psychology view on things, that there are different types of people and different developmental attitudes and needs and ways of viewing the world. So finding something that's mine, for example, is pretty important. That's ours against theirs. Theirs is something that's wrong, and ours is something that's very true, is a certain developmental and half developmental, half cultural. I don't want to use the word stage, but maybe a stage, but who knows? There is a lot of controversy in this area, but it's definitely a type of psychological structure that makes you think that if you don't believe in our God, you will burn in our hell. So I want to convert you to our faith out of compassion, because I don't want you to burn in our hell because of you not being converted to our faith. So, for example, my wife's sister, she is an anthropologist of the nomadic people of the Russian north, the reindeer herders, and she lives with them and travels the deer herding cycle with them and so forth. A real scientist, a very interesting person. So they know those a Christian. Polish, maybe, or Czech guys, living in the Russian far north in hopes of basically converting the pagans, right? That's what they actually there for. And they're very good people, obviously, and very loving and very sincere in what they do. But they do really believe that they are helping those people by hopefully converting them into believing into Jesus, because otherwise they are damned, right? So it's an interesting, I mean, what I'm saying is it is a certain way of looking at things, which is very different from what, for example, Shinzen promotes, or I basically endorse and promote. But my point that it doesn't go anywhere because it's a certain psychological structure that is extremely prevalent in the world in many, many different ways and shapes and colors. Us against them, basically, this kind of mentality. And the way Wilber and developmental psychologists view that is that it is developmental, meaning that all people necessarily go through those stages when, when getting older, starting from scratch, being born, and then egocentric stage of development, then ethno-group centric, us against them, and then maybe world centric, all of us, we're all in the same boat kind of thing. And yeah, I don't necessarily think that it is developmental as in those people have to grow up in order to get to our stage, which is more world-centric, obviously. But I do regard it as biased and partial, for sure, and leading to all kinds of conflicts, maybe also, which a more world-centric perspective could avoid and be able to deal with the problems that we actually have, real problems that we have as a species, as the world at large. I don't know. Now with that I'm blabbering about it, I'm thinking that it could as easily be explained with the use of the Buddhist lingo and the basic poisons, the three root afflictions that we have, which are ignorance, greed, and hatred, and all of the various hundreds and thousands of afflictions stemming from that. So maybe it could be as easily explained just through this framework as well, not necessarily developmental. Anyway, too much talking, sorry.
Well, that is the idea of this, Victor.
Oh, right. Yeah, right.
You're nailing it. That's very interesting that you've had this discussion with Shinzen in the last year. And so in that sense, I would be more inclined to give way to your reading of his view than what I previously said was my understanding. So I just want to sort of loop back to that because I asked for a comparison there. So thank you for that update. And I said I would change topics, so let's do that. As an aside, the problem with the world-centric view is that it only works if everyone else has a world-centric view. So in that sense, it's as arguably as dependent upon, how can we put it? It needs to be able to assert itself over those who have a different opinion. And in that sense, it's not too different to the fundamentalist missionaries, you could argue. And so developmentally, it may be geographically broader, but structurally, maybe just the same.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I definitely see what you mean. And yes, I do agree that it is hard to convey those ideas to those who don't endorse them in the first place. But at the same time, I do think that to regard all people as equal, for example, is a more advanced stance than thinking that Black people are less human in a sense than white humans are, which is ridiculous to even say this from where we come in the 2025, but which was a widespread understanding not so long ago. So a more universal view, I think, is superior, if not developmentally, then how should I put it?
It's more advanced on by its own measure. But in that sense, it's
by my measure. Let's put it this way, okay? By my measure,
it
would be an easy way out. I believe that is true.
Yeah, that's okay. I think to have a belief, to have a particular view, a sort of cultural or religious view that feels to you more universal and true than other forms. That is, in a way, the definition of such a thing. Of course, almost every view and religious position sees itself as the right one, and the others is somehow wrong by some measure or another, usually by its own measure. And the view you've expressed is no different to that, fundamentally, perhaps. But anyway, what about pragmatic dharma? So you've mentioned this word pragmatic dharma. I'm very curious if you ever went down that particular path, because you've been very involved in online communities, online retreats, online teachings, and you've talked about how vital that was in your own journey, both as a student and as a teacher, in fact, and how active you've been. So I'm sure you will have come across pragmatic dharma and some of the tenets of that, one of which, of course, is the idea that one can achieve various levels of enlightenment, which is something surprisingly not held by all enlightenment sects, and that one can really do it in quite a sort of repeatable way, and one ought to disclose that, or one can disclose that, and talk about it in sort of open source fashion, sort of approach to this, which is at odds, I'd say, with certain other kind of sects, which tend to emphasize, say, sort of secretiveness about one's attainments and so on and so forth. Did you ever get into that stuff? I'm curious. And
yeah, absolutely. Of course.
Tell me.
No, of course. By saying that I endorse and adhere to the pragmatic Dharma movement, I mean it in a broader sense. So not necessarily narrowing it down to like the likes of Kenneth Falk and Daniel Ingram and like pragmatic dharma in a narrow sense of that word. Bill Hamilton and his students, basically. But I do fully share the idea that this whole thing does not belong to a sect or a school or an ism, be it Buddhism or some other approach. As I've said, it's not even a belief. I know that it's ultimately derivable from this very moment of our experience if we are attentive enough. So I don't really have to believe it, really. Although, of course, I cannot claim that I've reached the further stages of this path. So in this regard, I don't know, of course, whether it's ultimately attainable in in the way that the sutras tell us about. But then again, the pragmatic movement guys recontextualize the sutras to their own liking, don't they? Saying that the jhanas, for example, concentration stages, okay, it's the way they're described is maybe too difficult to attain, so let's recontextualize them to mean a different thing, which is the so-called light jhanas. And then they are attainable. And yeah, well, we don't believe that the Buddha is really omniscient and, knowing all his past lives and knowing all the deeds of all the human beings, as, for example, the Mahayana texts put it. So I see that the pragmatic Dharma movement is caught in this kind of paradox, trap, dichotomy of, on one hand, claiming to be pragmatic and to be able to derive the operationalized knowledge from those old myths and get rid of all that's not necessary, while on the other hand, trying to preserve the stages, the maps, the ways they are described in those ancient texts, because there is no other way to relate to it, actually. And I don't think I don't think it can work too well, to be fair. It does give you some results, but then you get caught into that strange, situation where you call yourself an arahat, not pointing fingers, but we all know the cases, or the recent case of Delson Armstrong renouncing his attainments famously on your podcast, on your podcast. So first, embracing those stage models and claiming that you traverse them in order to later renounce the attainments and saying that, well, I actually don't really know. It's ironic, maybe. It's hard to it's hard to put it into words because there is a certain paradox. And it is definitely much easier for a traditional practitioner who just follows his teacher's advice and believes his teacher or her teacher sees their teacher as a guru, as a living Buddha, uh, and just practices following the teachings. And we, people of a more modernistic maybe take, are by necessity cherry picking. I mean that because we don't follow a certain tradition or a certain teacher wholeheartedly and without questioning, we end up cherry picking because what's the ultimate source of deciding what's right and what's wrong? In a traditional setting, it is your teacher who says to you what to do and what's right and what's wrong. And in a pragmatic setting, you are your own bar for deciding what's right and what's wrong. And it's an easy way into a dead end, into a trap, into a pit, into a certain situation where you end up doing some stuff that you try to make sense of by reading ancient materials and listening to all different kinds of teachers, but ultimately trying to make meaning by yourself of all this mess. And it's not necessarily the best way to achieve enlightenment, if you will. So again, it's not. I don't see it as a more beneficial approach to practice, but I do see that it's a different type of individuals that are drawn to this kind of approach to practice. And by being shaped a certain way, by having those certain proclivities, we end up with a different set of problems that then the traditional students end up with. And they have to make meaning by going deeper in their practice and going into a deeper relationship with their teacher, maybe. I'm not really sure. I'm not a traditional student, unfortunately. It's quite often that I think that it would be much easier actually to just, find a tradition and a teacher and just fall in to that. But the pragmatic people have to be more open-minded, maybe more inquisitive, more of a scholar practitioner kind of type mentality, that we have to do our own research in order to understand what's happening to us, in order to understand what do we do. But to round up this long speech, I do believe absolutely that all things enlightenment, awakening, Buddha nature, and whatnot can be described with contemporary, clear language without any Buddhist, scent to it. Because ultimately, I do believe or know that this is what's happening right here, right now, and that it is ultimately derivable from as a lived knowledge from this very experience. It's either here and now or nowhere, literally. It's either here right now, especially if we talk about it as something unchanging, eternal, undying, omnipresent, whatever way you want to put it, or not put it, different ways of talking about it, right? The apophatic way of, what it's not, or some positive qualities to it. But in any case, it could not be a second ago. It cannot be a second away from us in the future. Either we express it fully right now or not. Either we are, in a certain sense, in a full contact with it right now or not. It's not a prize to be obtained in a distant future, because it just doesn't work this way. It just doesn't make sense this way if we begin to actually think about it and practice, obviously. So even in the Buddhist tradition, especially Mahayana Buddhism, they talk about the Pratyeka Buddhas. And Pratyeka Buddhas are the solitary enlightened beings, meaning that they didn't have a teacher to teach them that they are self-awakened due to insight into the dependent origination nature of things, which is a core Buddhist idea, of course. And the implied idea here is that it is ultimately derivable even without the teacher, because it's a kind of a natural law of things, the way it actually works. Those people are rare. It's very hard to be a Pratyeka Buddha, but then again, we're not Pratyeka Buddhas in a strict sense anyway, because we encountered the teachings, and we were fortunate enough, as we were saying earlier, to meet the Dharma. So if this Pratyeka Buddha, without being an Indian person, without being a culturally Buddhist person, being born in the year 2536 on a Babylon 5 space station, could get this realization, this person would express it in a certain way available to that person at that particular time. So if you want, we can call it pragmatic Buddhism or pragmatic Dharma, or we can call it existential, embodied, enactive, whatever. But it's all the same in the end. So in this broader sense, I'm definitely a pragmatic Dharma practitioner and teacher.
How do you relate to this idea of stages, waypoints, watershed moments, etc.? You've hinted at some of those kinds of experiences in your own life, although you didn't equate them to any particular traditional category, right, or label.
Right.
How, in your own practice and teaching and so on, how do you relate to this sort of thing?
I do think that maps are useful. I side with Shinzen in this case, who doesn't like maps too much, doesn't like stages too much, because they narrow your path, maybe unnecessarily so. And also, some time ago, maybe a decade ago, I've translated this article by Jeff Warren, also a student of Shinzen's and a teacher, a Canadian mindfulness teacher, Jeff Warren. And he had this interesting article about the pitfalls of beliefs or something like that. And he had a very interesting take on it. He goes like this: I know this Buddhist teacher who practices this and that, and by going deeper in what he practices, he derives deep meaning and ease and bliss and whatnot. And I know this Christian nun, and by doing her practices, she goes deeper into what she practices and derives deeper meaning and ease and bliss and whatnot. And I know this and that. And he goes on, and then he talks about this idea. I actually used this word just a few sentences ago, an active approach, which is, of course, Evan Thompson's, Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson idea that we shape our life and unveil different aspects of our reality by the actions that we undertake. So the steps that we take shape the reality that we get to. So what Jeff was trying to convey is that by practicing in their own ways, they get deeper and deeper into their own ways of seeing the world that is shaped by the ways they were practicing. And the more they practice, the more they see the world the way their practice points them towards, which makes it actually harder to communicate in a sense, although their experience could be, in a certain sense, very similar, or their realization could be very similar, or how to say it, the end game, this feeling of freedom, this feeling of, well, ease and bliss could be very similar. But the way they make meaning of the world, of their lives, is utterly shaped by the way they practice. So it's very much the inactive approach that Evan Thompson talks about. And so I think that rather than seeing those stages as metaphysical givens that are somewhere out there for us to climb, to achieve, those are rather useful maps of what people found by doing certain practices. So it's actually the other way around, basically. So the way we can view those stage models is that they were validated by a huge number of people throughout the ages, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people who validated those stages in a sense that if you do those particular practices, you're gonna get to those particular stages. And that's how Mahasi's 16 stages of reaching nirvana work, and that is how the jhanas work, and that is how the 10 stages of Chuladasa work, and that is how all those different stage models work. Now, what I think would be a mistake is to equate those stage models with the ultimate true way of things. So I think there is a lot of pragmatic value in those maps, so that we actually do know that if you undertake this particular approach, say Mahasi Sayadaw Vipassana noting, you quite predictably get through those 16 stages towards nirvana and go through those cycles and whatever. Which I actually also did, so I can vouch it does work. Upandita's approach is that approach exactly. And all the suffering stages and all the renunciation stages and relinquishment and reevaluation and whatnot. It does work because you do those practices that were validated by hundreds of thousands of people. Would it mean that all contemplative practitioners have to go through dukkha jnanas, through the suffering stages of insight on their path? Not necessarily so. I don't think so. I do think that there could be maybe wiser ways of practice, given that Vipassana, Mahasi Vipassana is kind of brute force pushing to enlightenment kind of vibe, which I don't necessarily adhere to these days. More heart-based maybe these days. But in any way, there are certain watersheds that I think are actually there, quote unquote, that all people have to go through in their own way. So one watershed is what I call the thought-centered and presence-centered. This shift from the thought-centered life towards, or narrative-centered, life, towards presence-centered, or experiential, narrative to experiential, you may say. That's almost certainly something that contemplative people get to at a certain point. Because if you relate to everything that is happening in this very moment as to sensory experiences, meaning sight, sounds, touch, whatever, thoughts, you begin to see that thoughts are only one kind of those sensory experiences, and they don't cover much, actually. They're very transient, very porous, weightless, and they don't what would be the way to put it? They don't mix with other sensory strands that well, or that we usually relate to them in a way that we look at our experience through that layer, which colors all our experience in a certain way, narrative way, basically. We tell stories about the world and about our life and about ourselves. And so the first watershed, and I believe this is what's usually called an awakening experience, is when you realize that most of our lives is actually quite literally outside of our thoughts. So there are thoughts, and there are sights, and there are sounds, and there are whatever. So that is one huge watershed when you begin to live in a more presence-centered rather than thought-centered way. And you begin to live more and more often in this way. The second watershed, is it okay? Do I go on?
Oh, please do. This is very interesting.
Okay. So the second watershed, I would suggest maybe, is that when you realize that all those experiences are conscious experiences, meaning all of those experiences are something that is being experienced, meaning that the actual material that they are all made of is consciousness. So there is no sound that is not being an experience of hearing. And it doesn't mean much to talk about sounds separate from the experience of hearing, because it's not a sound if it's not heard by anyone. You know, this old parable of a tree falling in the forest. There is a clear answer to that. There is no question about it. It's not being heard. It's not a sound if no one hears it. But then again, if a firefly flies near that tree, it hears it. I'm not sure if I should put the quotes or if it actually hears, but for sure, the experience that it has is a very different experience from ours. But it is a conscious experience. What is it like to be a bat kind of thing? So it is definitely something like to be a bat. So it's all conscious experience. And then by this stage, you could get to an interesting crossroads or different facets of this realization that it's all consciousness. One insight could be that it's all one taste, literally made of one substance. And it's all, in a sense, you. Because if you dissociate with thoughts as sensory events, and then you can experience emotions as sensory events, and then you can experience physical sensations and ultimately everything as a flow of those sensory events, which is all consciousness, then a very natural way to relate to all that would be to identify yourself with this spaciousness that experiences it all, or spaciousness that includes it all, spaciousness, space, something like that. So that would be one facet. And another facet would, of course, be to realize that those sounds that we deem external to us, exterior to us, or those physical sensations of the exterior world, or the sights that we see as something outside of us, are not actually out there, but there is a very intimate sense of all of this being right here a very immediate sense, a very intimate sense, like Dogen, the Zen master, famously said that enlightenment is intimacy with all things. So that could be another facet, another watershed of dropping the boundary between the inside and the outside. And that could be a very natural development of just pouring our attention towards this experience in the present moment. So while not associating with your thoughts too much is a more psychotherapeutic maybe, and could be very applicable, could be very psychotherapeutic, this kind of insight is very existential, is very spiritual in essence. And then at that point, a trap is to identify with that space or spaciousness, to identify with that consciousness that experiences this all without actually being conditioned by it in a sense, being free from it in a sense. And it is a trap because it doesn't ultimately work this way. I'm probably too bold just saying that. But again, I do believe that it is ultimately derivable from this very moment, but also it is, in a sense, inactive, as we were saying, so that it's not necessarily derivable if you don't know where to look. Always this paradox, always this paradox. But the next watershed, I guess, I know, is that you see that it's not just the words that color our experience. And when we get rid of those words, we get into a bare awareness, things as they really are kind of thing, which is certainly not very true. But we can realize that the way everything appears to us and everything is experienced by us is ultimately colored by us in the deepest sense possible. So that when I look at this grayish wall, it is not grayish and it's not a wall. It is a wall to me, and it's gray to me because my eyes and my retina and my brain is made this way that I perceive it as such. And then the tree is not a tree, and its leaves are not leaves, and they're not green, and so forth. So I believe, I know, again, and it's a very important watershed, I think that we come to realize that our experience is deeply and deeply shaped by us. It is deeply subjective. And this is a very humbling knowledge if we take it in the right way. It's very much about the inconceivable nature of reality. It's very much about the unknowing, the big U kind of unknowing. And then if we take it the right way, we could come to this realization that well, it sounds very profound and Zen-like, but that that everything is everything, that everything is multipotential, is I call it the pregnant void kind of experience. It is void in a sense that it's ungraspable, it's nothing substantial. Everything that's substantial is my own way of making meaning of whatever's happening. That's substantial. But ultimately, the things in themselves are not. But it's multipotential in a sense that it could be anything. And it is basically anything and everything if we consider all kinds of sentient beings experiencing the same, quote unquote, I'm not sure how to put it, let's say the same reality. I do think it's very freeing to get to this stage. I do think that the Buddhists have a very deep insight into the ultimate non-identification with anything, that any particular view is necessarily wrong by just being partial and subjective. And if we do get to this stage, it's not only freeing for ourselves, it's also freeing because it frees us to relate to other people and to other sentient beings because we know our reality as being utterly subjective. This is this way. No, this is this way kind of situation. Yes, of course. Of course. My partner sees a very different reality. The earlier I understand this, the better. My child, my son, sees a very different reality. The earlier I get to terms with this, the better our dialogue can be. I could actually be interested in knowing his side of the story. So it has, it's not only existentially freeing, it is ultimately very applicable as well. And so the way I see this training, my personal comprehensive framework, if you will, is that it is this same set of skills, but honed to different levels, it yields different results. So we can talk about, ordinary weak attention skills and the results we all see around us, or ordinary weak emotional intelligence skills, and we all see what's happening around us and within us. Okay, let's be fair. But then it could be developed to an ordinary strong levels, and then again it could be developed to the extraordinary levels. And the same attentional training that could be of use to Marine officers, by the time they take time and effort to develop it, if they want, if they are exposed to this culture we're talking about, obviously, if they know about this stuff, if they are interested enough in that, and take it to extraordinary levels, they see all those kinds of effects that I was just describing. Maybe not necessarily these particular, but I think the thought-based, the the switch from thought-based to presence-based is almost inevitable. Let's put it this way. Maybe not so with the more advanced stuff, because it is different in many traditions, for example, also. So yeah, just because I see it as training done on the same spectrum of things, from the weak skills to ordinarily strong to extraordinary, I don't see too much paradox or problem in teaching it in applicable ways or existentially, spiritually meaningful ways. That would be one way to put it. Yeah. Whew.
Wow, that was so interesting, Victor. This has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on all of these quite a number of topics actually we've explored, haven't we, today?
Thanks for asking. Thanks for providing this opportunity to share. And it is quite difficult for me in English, for sure. I hope it was not very clear, but unfortunately it was very clear to me internally that I couldn't be as, fluent and expressive. But hopefully the major part of it was conveyed the way I intended it.
I thought it came across very well, and there didn't appear to be any barrier to understanding the language, so that's a testament to your English skill, and probably to the clarity of your thinking too.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure and quite a deep conversation indeed. I enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.